So back in the fall of 2019, the International Journalists Association launched an investigation into the Chinese government's relationship with the media. And they discovered that certain reporters had been invited to sign agreements with Chinese counterparts to distribute propaganda throughout their home countries. In the Philippines, it's estimated that more than half of the stories on a Philippine news wire came from a Chinese state agency.
So media columnist for the New York Times, Ben Smith, he joins us now to discuss. Ben, I thought this was an incredibly important piece because you contextualize it around COVID and the very beginning. What did you find around this Chinese state media arm?
Well, what's so interesting is this was a study done by the International Federation of Journalists, which is a union of journalist unions, which, you can imagine the meetings. But it gives them this funny bird's eye view into what's happening in more than 100 different countries, which you don't usually get. What's happening in Guinea-Bissau right now? Who knows? And in terms of the media, and I think what they did was they kind of surveyed their members and found oh, that's weird. The same thing that's happening in Serbia is happening in Kenya, and that there was sort of not a kind of lockstep orchestrated push, but obviously broad strategy to spend money, basically getting the Chinese, making connections between Chinese news sources and local media, really everywhere in every language. That's what's so amazing. I mean, they're doing it in Serbian and they're doing it in, all sorts of in Portuguese, all sorts of places that we're not spending our time checking out what's happening in the local media in these markets.
Right.
So where do Chinese propaganda efforts echo American efforts, and where do they diverge?
Well, that's interesting. The Chinese point of view on this is what the U.S. does. This was Voice of America, things like that. And I actually think they're not that similar. The Chinese one is wrapped around to some large degree their Belt and Road strategy, which is this kind of debt and investment package where they're building infrastructure and making money off it, all over the world, but particularly in, very broadly speaking, in Asia and Africa. It's also not this sort of intensely messaged propaganda. It's kind of a broad sense of we'd like to tell China's story. Not, I think, what you often imagine from an American perspective is that there's this titanic struggle between freedom and communism, and the Chinese are out there telling everybody communism is great and America is bad. And if you look at the content, it's really not that.
And Ben, I know the Chinese Foreign Ministry responded to some of what you said in a very long thing. And what was that like to see the pushback? Do you think that you nailed something that they're very sensitive about and don't want drawn to attention? I just thought it was pretty remarkable that the foreign ministry of the second most powerful country on earth would take the time to go through such a detailed response to you.
It was really interesting. I think they are very sensitive to the power of American media. They're also, in China, they are at this huge advantage, which is that they have effectively a monopoly on control of the media. And so they aren't operating in a sort of competitive market for attention and for ideas. And when you take that style of communications to the United States, you get, China Daily, which is everywhere, and I kind of happily recycle all the time and occasionally use to prop up my standing desk, but no one reads. And I think a lot of their content is really not competitive, essentially, and not getting people's attention, not working. And I think in their view, then they look at Netflix and Disney Plus and CNN and say, I can't believe the Americans are whining about our very weak efforts, which maybe seem large in the scale of what a government is doing, but they also see the American private sector as essentially continuous with American government propaganda, which is obviously not how we see the world. Right. But I do think it's just indisputable that Netflix and Disney are these just massive projections of American cultural power that nobody is anywhere near equaling, and that it's interesting, even as America, thinks of itself as in decline in some ways, its sort of ability to project culture through those streaming platforms is really stronger than it has ever been.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that you talk about, too, is while the Chinese propaganda can seem very obvious and very ham-handed, it's still actually, even as you're reading it and knowing that this is obvious ham-handed propaganda, can still actually have an impact. Talk about that piece.
Yeah, there's a really interesting study by by I think a professor at University of Southern California, where she basically, I mean, I think they did it with RT, but they brought in a bunch of, college kids or whoever you do these studies on and said, this is Russian propaganda, and showed it to them and then said, has it changed your mind? And people said, yeah, basically yes. And the knowledge that something is that is propaganda, the little disclaimer tag on Twitter, doesn't have the kind of impact on people's consumption of the content that you might expect.
Yeah,
Very
that's
interesting.
really fascinating. Ben, I really enjoyed the piece. Thank you for joining us, man.
Always great to talk to you, Ben.
Yeah,
Thank you. Coming up, we've got Ryan Grimm on. He's going to talk about Senators Joe Manchin and Lisa Murkowski's latest bipartisan proposal when Rising returns.